Hello and welcome back. I believe this break has given you a clue as to what we will elaborate on next during the fourth and final CoMuseum session on greening the museum and wellness for visitors and staff. Horniman Museum and Gardens launched the 2020 Climate and Ecology Manifesto, outlining a plan of action to mitigate against climate emergency by putting the environment at the heart of their mission, programming, and collections. We are very honored to have with us the Chief Executive of Horniman Museum and Gardens, Nick Merriman, who will give us a presentation on how museums can help mitigate the climate and ecological crisis.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is my title. My name is Nick Merriman from the Horniman in London. And my topic is how can museums help mitigate the climate and ecological crisis? On the day in which the United Nations General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, has said that humans are waging a suicidal war on nature, my starting point is to ask, why should museums have a role in this? Isn't solving the climate and ecological crisis best left in the hands of politicians and business people because they can work at the right kind of scale? However, I strongly believe that museums do have a special role to play for three reasons. Firstly, museums are institutions of the long term. We keep our collections in perpetuity. Some of our museums hold examples of collections from all 6 mass extinction events in the history of the Earth, including the most recent one, the Anthropocene. And they take the long-term view beyond political and economic cycles. They are trusted. Secondly, they're trusted by the public, institutions to be so. In the UK, a recent survey of nearly 1,000 people by an organization called Ipsos Mori showed museum curators to be one of the professions most trusted to tell the truth, just behind scientists, teachers, and doctors, and far ahead of police, civil servants, politicians, business people, and even the clergy. And thirdly, museums have mass appeal. UNESCO says there are 95,000 museums in the world. In the UK alone, over 80 million visits are made to museums each year, which are more than all of the visits to football matches or to churches. So all of this tells me that museums do have a distinctive role to play by bringing a long-term perspective to the climate and ecological crisis, which is trusted for its credibility and can engage large numbers of people. So, given that museums have this role, potentially, what can they actually do? And it seems to me they can work in 2 main areas. The first one is to get their own houses in order by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, their waste, and their pollution, and improving their ecological footprint. Take my own organization as an example. The Horniman declared a climate and ecological emergency in July last year, and then we published a manifesto at the beginning of this year. This committed us to certain key targets, such as being greenhouse gas neutral by 2040, recycling almost 100% of our food and gardens waste, removing single-use plastics, and introducing a green travel plan. This green travel plan included reducing business flying and using more video conferencing, but we never imagined in January that a global pandemic would actually necessitate this. Crucially, our manifesto is accompanied by a detailed action plan with a dedicated working group to ensure that it's realized. Just as crucially, we have made climate and ecological issues central to our mission rather than something that's done alongside everything else. Too often, this kind of work is done by people who are personally passionate about it, but do it as an extra to their day job. As a result, it remains under-resourced and at the edges of the organization. If we are to deliver real change, we have to ensure that it is a strategic priority for the museum as a whole. Whether you're a museum of archaeology or of textiles or of local history, as organizations of the long term, you cannot ignore the impacts of unsustainable practices on the planet. And I would urge you to make action to tackle these issues one of your key goals. Making practical changes, though, is difficult and requires real commitment. You need to have an agreed way of monitoring your progress. A good place to start, if you can, is a carbon audit as a benchmark for how you're doing. Energy usage can usually easily be monitored. You should also try to monitor current levels of waste. None of this is easy. For example, waste actually has to be physically weighed. But whatever you do, you need to have a way of measuring your progress each year, and you have to have people who are really on top of the detail on this. You need the geeks and the nerds who like counting emissions, waste, and so on. It's important also to focus on priorities. The biggest source of an organization's direct greenhouse gas emissions are through energy consumption, through oil, through gas, or through non-renewable electricity. We need to plan to move away from these over time, ultimately to renewable electricity. At the Horniman, we're beginning to do this by creating an energy centre, which will allow us over the next decade or so to move away from gas boilers to a combination of ground and air source heat pumps, solar, and renewable mains electricity. This will be a huge change because, I understand, it means we also have to replace all of our pipework and our radiators in the building as well. Another huge area of secondary energy consumption is travel. The pandemic has shown us new ways of conducting international and even national business, like we are now, without meeting face to face. So this will hopefully continue. The BISO group, the largest international art museums, has, as I understand, recently agreed to move to virtual couriering for loaned objects. So if this happens, this would be a big step forward because it would show the way for all museums in relation to their loan patterns. However, a recent carbon audit at the Tate Galleries, covering 2018 to 19, included the carbon footprint of visitors to Tate as well. The audit calculated the total footprint of Tate for that year was 260,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 92% of which was visitor travel. This is a real dilemma. The best way for Tate to reduce its carbon footprint would therefore be to close to the public. Now, clearly, that's not desirable. So we have to do what we can to encourage local visitors to use green methods of transport like cycling or walking or public transport. And we'll have to think about what we can do about visitors coming from further away. For Tate, I understand that one of their proposed solutions is to concentrate more on getting local visitors and to de-emphasize their reliance on international tourists, whilst, of course, still welcoming them. As I've mentioned, we're living not just in a climate emergency, but also an ecological emergency where we're seeing destruction of habitats through deforestation, intensive farming practices, and pollution. So we also need to do what we can to mitigate these on our own sites. Many museums are putting in green roofs, beehives, insect hotels, and so on. At the Horniman, for example, we have 6.5 hectares of park and gardens, flanked by a very busy main road. Next to the road, earlier this year, we established a bee garden, which includes 2 wildflower meadow areas, 3 bee hotels, 6 hexagonal raised beds with 29 floral species that attract and provide food for bees, with a sculpture called The Flower Girl by Jasmine Pradicito, which is made from Noxtex, which is a material that absorbs nitrogen dioxide pollution from the air. The material also, we also have, I'm just showing a slide of this, if I can change. No, there we are, there it's changing. We also have pollution monitors in the garden, which also have public displays in our galleries, so visitors can actually look at the levels of road pollution nearby. But that's not only what museums can do. The second major area of work, apart from getting their houses in order, is the way in which they can engage the public. Traditionally, the mode of museums has been to operate in broadcast mode. So in other words, concentrating on facts and figures. The thinking was that if only we communicated how great a problem climate and ecological work was, then people would take notice and demand changes. Unfortunately, research, especially amongst behavioral psychologists, has shown that when bombarded with pictures of enormous things like burning rainforests or melting glaciers and terrifying statistics, most people retreat. They feel overwhelmed and also feel there's little they can do themselves. They feel disempowered. I guess that many of us who've done exhibitions and events around climate change have often used this broadcast mode. However, psychologists have also shown how to break through this feeling of disempowerment. They've found that one way of motivating people about the climate crisis is to appeal very personally to their feelings of love towards their children, grandchildren, or nephews and nieces, the next generation. In other words, the thing that will spur them to action is an appeal to emotion, particularly when it's personal. This chimes very much with our findings at the Horniman. About 75% of our audience is families with young children, and we know that the adults bringing them are very worried about the future these kids will be growing up in when we do or don't meet carbon reduction targets. We also know that they are yearning to know what they may be able to do about it themselves. Without realizing it, we've already tapped into this in our programming. For example, last year for World Oceans Day and for 2 months thereafter, we did an intervention in our aquarium, which is normally full of fish and so on, around plastic pollution. What we did is, for a period of 2 months, we took out the fish and replaced them with examples of plastic rubbish. I'm going to show you some examples here if the slides move on. I'll have to wait. We'll see if the slides come up. Essentially, the tanks in our aquarium were filled with rubbish, and we also took our jellyfish out of our jellyfish tank and replaced them with plastic bags. I'm afraid the slides don't seem to be changing. This was very shocking for our visitors, and we got a strong emotional reaction. And one of the examples of that is a small child who visited with her mother. She was so shocked about plastic pollution that she went home and wrote a 20-page booklet about its dangers, which they sent to their local Member of Parliament. So that's an example of the way in which an intervention engaging the emotions can lead to actual practical action. Other examples, of course, are the work of artists, such as Olafur Eliasson, who very memorably brought blocks of glaciers outside Tate Modern last year, which then melted slowly in front of visitors. At the Horniman, we've called our next major project Nature and Love, to reflect the importance of our love of the next generation, as well as our love of nature as an impetus for action. I won't go into details here, but I did want to mention one aspect of it, which tries to move from engagement to action. This is in our notion of developing an environmental champions club. Our aim is to recruit 500 families who will commit to making changes in their own lives to live more sustainably. As club members, they'll be given tools to measure their current footprint, ideas for how to reduce their carbon footprint and waste. They'll be given inspiring talks from experts, and crucially, they will form a mutual support network to share successes and things that didn't work. We hope it'll be led by the children, and it'll have rewards and badges, as you'd expect in this kind of family-orientated club. If it's successful, we hope the idea can be rolled out by any museum or similar organisation. Our message is that small changes made by many people can have a great overall impact. In addition, we will really be encouraging club members to become active citizens in relation to the climate and ecological crisis. Whilst as a museum, we can't be overtly political, but we can certainly say to club members, here is what science is saying. You don't have to feel disempowered. You can actually do something about it by writing to politicians and companies, by voting, or making your views known in other ways. Here, the museum, I think, is moving quite a long way from being in broadcast mode to being in empowerment mode. Finally, in terms of what museums can do, I think we need to collaborate and work in partnership much more. Many of us are reinventing the wheel in our carbon reduction schemes and our public engagement work. In the UK, we've recently convened a working group for all of the major museums in the country to share information and good practice around these issues. And we held a conference recently, the recordings of which are available. We will also have greater impact if we work with other organisations, from large ones such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or more locally. For example, at the Horniman, we host the London Environmental Educators Network. All of this is particularly vital as 2021 will soon be upon us. The UK is hosting the International Climate Change Conference, known as COP26, described as the most important climate event since the 2015 Paris Agreement. The pandemic has shown us that our relationship with nature and the planet needs even more urgent action. Over the coming months, I feel museums need to speak loudly and publicly about the need for action, drawing on their long-term perspective and by providing examples both of actions that can be taken and by encouraging their publics to become active citizens in relationship to these issues. Thank you for listening.